So my name is Bethany Wiggin, and I direct the new Penn program in Environmental Humanities. And I'm really delighted to welcome you here today to talk about this important topic in the wake of COP21 and the agreement in Paris. The event has been generously co-sponsored by the Penn Humanities Forum and the Penn Museum, as I just mentioned. We will have a time for Q&A, of course, after the panelists speak, and Penn Program in Environmental Humanities Research Fellow Tricia Kim will be circulating with a wireless mic, and we would ask you to use the wireless mic so that the video recording sound quality is sufficient. We're also co-sponsored by the Green Campus Partnership, and we're very happy to be #PowerDownPartners during this month's Power Down Challenge, which you can see here. It's a month-long series of diverse events culminating on February 24th and a campus-wide energy reduction challenge. So before I introduce our panelists to you today, I just want to tell you very briefly about the program in Environmental Humanities and particularly why we decided to organize this discussion today. The initial idea came from research fellow and PhD candidate in Spanish, Steve Dolph. Steve texted me to say, shouldn't we plan something after COP21? So really, it's Steve who should be moderating today, but he, for the best of reasons, cannot be here. Steve and his family are welcoming an addition, daughter Louisa Francesca, who just weighed in at 8 pounds, 12 ounces, and is 23 inches long. So this academic year, the Environmental Humanities 12 research fellows meet weekly. And in the weeks and days leading up to the meeting in Paris, our group's emotional temperature seemed to fluctuate a bit with news about what was coming in Paris, and fluctuated from cautious optimism to despair to just a tiny bit hopeful. So COP21 and the Paris Agreement have provided a little bit of hope, I think, for everyone. And that little bit of hope has been a most welcome break from the experience of crisis many feel when faced with the news, for example, about how the leading candidates for the Republican presidential nomination view climate change. As Pouné Saberi reported earlier this week in the pages of the journal Science, Ted Cruz has used his position as head of a Senate subcommittee that oversees climate research to question recent temperature trends. Marco Rubio, who came in third in Iowa, has said that the climate is always changing while dodging what role humans might play. And Donald Trump? Well, unsurprisingly, Trump, as you probably know, has called climate change a hoax and a money-making industry. He has said he believes in weather as well as clean, immaculate air, but not climate change. So the Republican Party, in other words, remains one of the last places on earth where climate deniers are given refuge. But let's not forget, the Republican Party is one of our country's two major political parties. And even as recent poll numbers document that climate denial is on the decline, this season's primaries remind us that climate deniers are also electable. Many people, and perhaps especially young people, feel overwhelmed by the prospects we face. PPEH research fellow Jess Haller wrote to me recently, quote, "The Anthropocene is not an occasion for poetry. It is not an excuse to resuscitate philosophers, to prop up the ivory tower, to make claims for the salvific force of the avant-garde. It is an honest-to-God crisis," end quote. Other colleagues who I see in the audience have reported that their teenage children are in a white panic about the problems we face. Even with possible technological fixes, our political tools to implement them often seem inept. My 8-year-old son, for example, simply cannot understand why officials at Volkswagen who fooled emissions testers on purpose are not in jail. Out of the mouths of babes. But how do we grown-ups deal with our children's sense of crisis and in some cases their despair? So personally, I'm a great believer in gallows humor. So one joke goes, "Are you concerned what will happen to cities when the polar ice caps melt? Don't be. New names have already been chosen. Atlantis City, New Jersey. Periscope, France. Salem, Massachusetts. Helsinki, Finland. And Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." Now, a more serious way to deal with despair, though not necessarily a humorless way, as Donald Trump proves, is to roll up our sleeves, figure out how we got in this mess, and what we can do to fix it. I imagine that's why some of you are here today, and I'm really glad to see you. You will soon hear from these experts who can help us explore the carbon landscape and waters of Philadelphia and to understand what is at stake if we are to move into a post-carbon future. Well over half of the world's people live today in cities. Now, this is great news. Cities are the political communities which are rapidly and successfully developing tools to help us survive the fix we're in. In the United States, for example, New York, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia have committed to 80 by 50. That is, they have publicly committed to decrease emissions by 80% from 2012 levels, 80% by 2050. 2 months ago in San Diego, where a Republican mayor governs with a Democratic city council, San Diego decided to shift to 100% renewable energy, including wind and solar power. It's our cities, then, and city politics where we see more beacons of hope after the spark of COP21. Our panelists today are experts in Philadelphia's city and regional carbon histories and futures, and I'm just delighted that they all, almost within like minutes of receiving our invitation, said yes. It was a great relief, I would say. And I've asked them to speak for about 5 minutes each about the implications of COP21 for their work and for the Philadelphia and Mid-Atlantic region more generally. After that, we'll moderate a discussion between them as they have some time to respond to one another and to ask each other questions. And after that, we'll have ample time for a Q&A from the floor. As I mentioned, Tricia Kim will have a wireless mic. Just hold up your hand and Tricia will try to get to you in the order that she sees you. With no further ado, our panelists, I'm going to introduce them in the order that they'll speak. Brian Black. Brian, can you just wave? Brian Black is a preeminent historian of energy, environmental history, and the cultural drivers beyond energy consumption. This fall, with Penn's very own Anne Green, Brian edited a special issue of Pennsylvania's leading history journal on the state's energy cultures. His groundbreaking book, Petroleum, The Landscape of America's First Oil Boom, published with Johns Hopkins in 2003, explored the Commonwealth's energy history and provided a critical conceptual tool, one that indeed I have found very useful myself. The tool is the sacrificial landscape. Brian has recently been involved in a documentary project at the Penn State Museum about the Marcellus Shale, and he has served as an energy consultant for National Public Radio, as well as for the BBC's Planet Oil series. Our second speaker will be Peter DeCarlo. Pete, can you just wave? Pete comes to us today from Drexel, where he joined the faculty after holding policy fellowships at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, as well as a postdoctoral fellowship at the Paul Scherrer Institute in Switzerland. He received his PhD in atmospheric science from the University of Colorado in 2007. He's the recipient of the Sheldon Friedlander Award from the American Association of Aerosol Research for his outstanding doctoral thesis. At Drexel, the DeCarlo group specializes in air quality and the climate impacts of particulate matter. They work at sites across the globe, from South Asia to Antarctica, where DeCarlo is the primary investigator on a grant from the National Sciences Foundation. Their Antarctic data sets are of value for a variety of fields in atmospheric chemistry, in climate modeling, paleoclimatology, and glaciology. More generally, DeCarlo is invested in how to communicate the science of climate change to broader audiences such as today's. Our third speaker will be Pouné Saberi. Pouné is a physician and a national board member of the highly respected nonprofit Physicians for Social Responsibility. Her work on that board took her to Paris late last year, where she attended COP21. Climate change, as the journal The Lancet has emphasized, is the most pressing public health challenge now globally. Pouné is a leader in the medical community's efforts to conceptualize the increasing overlap between public health and environmental health. John Conley. John is the Vice President of Project Development for the profit company, not Solar City. After undergraduate years at Dartmouth College, John went on to complete a master's degree in development economics and finance from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Prior to joining Solar City, John directed project development for SunPower Corporation, where he personally developed more than 50 megawatts of distributed generation photovoltaic projects throughout the United States. He began his solar career as the Eastern United States Director of Development for Ipuran, the finance and development arm of Conergy AG. Now at Solar City, John manages a team that originates and develops distributed generation solar projects worth more than $300 million annually for commercial and public sector customers. Sarah Wu. Sarah, as many of you know, is Deputy Director for Planning at the City of Philadelphia's Office of Sustainability. In late 2015, Philadelphia released its second climate plan, this one superseding the first Greenworks, and now turning to focus on climate adaptation. I think it's really a visionary document, and if you haven't had a chance to read it, you'll really want to. Sarah is its lead author. It talks about Philadelphia, and it provides, well, it doesn't call it Philadelphia, of course, but it provides great advice about how to adapt to what all climate models predict will be a hotter, wetter Philadelphia. Our final speaker this afternoon will be David Masur. Since 2002, David Masur is the Executive Director of Penn Environment and the Penn Environment Research and Policy Center. David has been quoted in nearly every TV, radio station, and newspaper in the Commonwealth for his environmental expertise. He focuses most of his energy working on open space protection, Marcellus shale gas drilling, and clean water issues in Pennsylvania, a topic very much on our minds as we think of those in Flint, Michigan. Most recently, David chaired Philadelphia Mayor Jim Kenney's transition team for the environment and sustainability, and I'm delighted to welcome him and all of our panelists this afternoon.
All right, thanks for your patience. Thanks to everybody for putting this great panel together. I feel like I'm totally the lucky one up here because I don't know the others and I get to benefit from getting to know them and hearing the great work that they're going on. I kind of interpreted my role to be as kind of a contextualizer, and so I just prepared a little bit of a commentary here, and I'll just buzz through that. But again, thank you, Bethany, for putting this together. We live in fascinating times when Georgetown historian John McNeill dubs the 20th century as the prodigal century. He substantiates these hyperbolic claims with data on the scale and intensity of human living to substantiate them. Quote, the world's economy in the late 20th century was about 120 times larger than that of the year 1500. Most of the growth took place after 1820. The fastest growth came between 1950 and 1973, but the whole period since World War II saw economic growth at rates entirely unprecedented in human experience, end quote. Energy was the key. McNeill estimates in his writing that the age of steam and coal during the 1800s increased worldwide energy harvest by 5 times, but then by another 16 times in the 20th century, with oil, natural gas, etc., joining the club. Quote, we have probably deployed more energy since 1900 than in all of human history before 1900. End quote. Indeed, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania played a critical role in the construction of this prodigality by providing prime movers energy sources. First, with biomass and coal, Pennsylvania ushered in the largest expansion in history with the discovery and development of petroleum after 1859. We also hosted much of the initial efforts to industrialize our lives on the backs of these new energy resources through innovations such as railroads, iron and steel, manufacturing, and many more. In short, in Pennsylvania, we know energy transitions. Each section of our human story is literally divided by such moments in the Commonwealth. Driven by industry or individual, the blockades of the War of 1812 fueled a shift from water power and burning wood to fueling furnaces with coal from the Appalachian Mountains. Moments such as the Centennial Exposition of 1876, with its coreless engine, revealed expansive possibilities that were only intensified with the inclusion of Pennsylvania crude oil. Philadelphia even led the momentary emergence of electric vehicles between 1890 and 1900. In the 20th century, Pennsylvania fueled the nation's industrial rise and helped to power the conspicuous consumption that defined the prodigality of the American century, as it became known. In my work as an environmental historian, I argue that Americans have been engrossed in a new transition, essentially away from carbon-based fossil fuels after the 1970s. Diversification of energy production has been one attribute of this transition, and although taking place against many entrenched economic, political, and cultural interests, in the last few decades, the Commonwealth has seen more and more of its energy derived from sources such as wind and, of course, natural gas harvested from fracturing Marcellus shale, not to mention solar. Didn't want you to feel left out. Both the market for these newer sources and the technology to produce them also demark our transitional moment. From my vantage point, though, these do not yet make the most fascinating portion of our current moment of energy transition. Supporting these new approaches to energy development is a complex post-1970 construction of a new culture that I find most invigorating. It is emergent enough that it is still called by a variety of names: sustainability, green culture, environmental economics, etc. For our purposes, though, I would argue that it is a conglomeration of these efforts to apply new understandings to our planning and economic development strategies. I share the stage with inspiring young professionals who embody this new era with designs on changing how we live. One of the most critical portions of this new way of thinking is the scientific understanding of climate change. Since 1980, we have seen climate change transform from simply another environmental cataclysm on our list of woe to a foundational premise for understanding how we live and how we need to live in the future. As this concept has moved into the phases referred to as mitigation and adaptation, we have seen concrete steps taken by some Pennsylvania communities. Through plans such as Greenworks and Growing Stronger, I believe that Philadelphia, partly based on the hard work and emphatic attention of some of the people that you see before us right now, has defined itself as a leader in this new era. This shift in thinking received a remarkable boost, in my opinion, recently on the international sphere. Known as COP21, the international agreement reached in Paris late last year is a symbol and reality secured a shared commitment to adapting human life to an awareness of our larger impacts on Earth. So how exactly will COP21 change our future in this region? I think that it is best to view it as a concrete step in permanently securing a foundation for expanding the initiatives already begun. It is in these transitional opportunities that we clearly see the promising potential of our moment, an era that scientists and others have recently taken to referring to as the Anthropocene, in which activities of humans determine Earth's future. In The Sixth Extinction, which was awarded last year's Pulitzer Prize in nonfiction, Elizabeth Kolbert writes, quote, "Right now, in the amazing moment that to us counts as the present, we are deciding, without quite meaning to, which evolutionary pathways will remain open and which will forever be closed. No other creature has ever managed this, and it will, unfortunately, be our most enduring legacy," end quote. COP21 is further evidence that just as our prodigal century enabled great technical and economic advancements, it has also defined new understandings that allow us to plan for a different kind of future. I am honored to share the stage with folks who are part of putting this new reality to work. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to any comments or questions.
Okay. I'd like to thank the organizers for extending the invitation to me and all of you for coming. How is COP21 going to impact things that I do, things that I think about on a daily basis? So my research focuses on air quality and climate, and these things are related. They deal with chemicals in the atmosphere, but they're different. There's definitely overlap. But I like to think of it as air quality as a local issue. It's something that impacts health in a much more direct way. things that impact air quality really do happen mostly nearby. Climate, on the other hand, I think of as more of a global issue. It's emissions from all around the world that are impacting the Earth's atmosphere and the Earth system. And different countries have different roles to play in that, but it's a different scale. Air quality pollutants such as particulate matter and ozone, these are things that we monitor for health purposes, and they are monitored by the EPA by law. Things like CO2 and methane are much more climate-relevant pollutants. Those are pollutants that aren't directly impacting our health, but they directly impact climate, and in an indirect way can impact our health by changing the temperature of the globe. And in doing so, it encourages pollutant formation that is formed in the atmosphere through chemical reactions. So one of the expected outcomes of a warmer climate is that you have increased ozone in urban areas where a lot of people live. And so that's one way in which climate change can impact air quality, and it's one of these overlaps between air quality and climate that we're interested in. So how does COP21, how is that going to impact things in terms of air quality and climate in our region? And to really understand that, we also need to think about local legislation in the United States that has happened roughly at the same time as COP21, and that's the Clean Power Plan. A lot of our climate emissions, our CO2 emissions and our greenhouse gas emissions are related to energy infrastructure. And the Clean Power Plan was proposed by the EPA. It's currently in its final rule, and states have to comply with reductions in CO2 mass emissions by state or CO2 rate emissions by state. And so we expect, or by law, these states have to reduce their CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions up to 2035. And the targets set by COP21 and the Clean Power Plan for the energy sector are roughly in line. So if predictions go according to plan, we will see reductions in greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector, from the power generation side of things. And what do I mean by that? I mean that at the point of power production, when you burn coal, natural gas, these are the ones that are producing the CO2 intensity of natural gas power generation is roughly half of that of coal. That's great. That's half the CO2 emissions right there. It's a little bit cleaner from an air quality perspective as well. Natural gas is cleaner than coal. I would hesitate to say it's clean, but it's cleaner than coal. But the things that aren't being accounted for in that point of power production is what happens before that natural gas gets to the power plant. And so this is one of the things that my research has started to look at. We measured methane emissions and other air quality emissions in the Marcellus Shale region in 2012, and we went back last year to do some follow-up measurements in partnership with the Clean Air Council, and we made additional measurements, and we found that methane background levels in the northeastern part of the state are increasing. So the more generation we have, the more greenhouse gases like methane are being released. And so that's not accounted for in the power production side of things. So if we're emitting greenhouse gases like methane before we get to the point of power production, then that 50% reduction in CO2 emissions is kind of false. We have to account for those emissions upstream and really take those into account. And there's a lot of effort to start to look at this and account for that, but there's really nothing on the books right now to do that. And so that's something that I think in the future we have to look forward to. So where else is CO2 coming from? CO2 is coming from traffic. We have to reduce our traffic emissions. I envision there will be a shift to more hybrid vehicles, reductions in CO2 emissions from the traffic sector, improved fuel efficiency. This is great from a climate perspective and also from an air quality perspective. If you're burning less diesel, don't drive VWs, or gasoline-powered vehicles, then you're emitting fewer pollutants. And so from an urban area where we live and where a lot of people drive, these are things that really do drive local air quality. So improvements in fuel efficiency and introduction of more hybrid vehicles or electrification of vehicles for mass transit are going to be a net benefit for air quality as well as climate. And that's something that I'm interested in monitoring through measurements that we do at Drexel University in my lab. Overall, I envision that coal is going to be phased out. I think a lot of people have the same idea. And the question is, what do we replace it with? And right now, the cheapest thing to replace it with, and the direction that a lot of people are going, is natural gas. Is that a great idea? It's not my decision to make. It's not anyone, I mean, I can input the measurements that I do and try to add those to the policy discussion, but right now, the economic incentives are such that natural gas is probably the cheapest way to replace that coal and the thing that can do it on the shortest timescale. Is that good? I personally don't believe that's a good thing, but it is what it is. And what that also means in Pennsylvania especially is that the Marcellus Shale will continue to be used to generate that natural gas, and that where that gas is refined or where that gas is taken is something that is still, I think, being decided. So that's some of the things that I think about when I'm looking towards how is COP21 going to be implemented, how is the US going to make the targets that are set in COP21, how does other legislation such as the Clean Power Plan fit into that equation, and ultimately what does that mean for climate and air quality relevant pollutants in this region and globally.
So thank you for inviting me. My name is Pouné Saberi, and I'm a physician in Occupational and Environmental Medicine. And as Bethany explained, I sit on the board of Physicians for Social Responsibility. And the work that PSR, I'm going to refer to it as PSR from now on, does is mainly focus on what we believe are the two gravest public health threats of our time: nuclear weapons and climate change. I spend a lot of my time working on how to communicate with the public, with media, with our decision makers about the health impacts of climate change, and particularly with a focus on the health threats from fossil fuel use. I did attend the COP21 as a health delegate. It was an amazing experience. Loved every minute of it. And people are like, did you go and eat here and eat there? And I was like, no, I was in this conference from morning to night. But you might say, well, why were you there? As a health delegate, we were focused on the inclusion of the concept of health in the agreement. In other words, bringing the fact that our decisions, policymakers' decisions, have a direct impact on people's health and the public health. And so I'm elated to say that it did make it in there. It did make it into the agreement, and I'm actually going to read one of the passages that it appears in. Okay. The parties to this agreement acknowledge that climate change is a common concern of humankind. Parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider the respecting obligations on human rights, the right to health, the right of indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disabilities, and people in vulnerable situations, and the rights to development, as well as gender equality, empowerment of women, and intergenerational equity. Like, doesn't that make you feel, yeah, right? Doesn't that make you feel like it's going to be a beautiful world? So the right to health is one of the places, and that's, you know, an incredibly important context, especially when we talk about issues like climate justice, you know, and environmental justice, that anybody living anywhere should have the right to remain healthy. The second instance where it appears is in a slightly different context, but also supremely important, and that's where it talks about the co-benefits of health. The topic of co-benefits of health are really important, especially in the context of, you know, Clean Power Plan, which, you know, I'm sure David will talk about. And what that means is this. For example, transportation is a significant contributor to greenhouse gases. If we switch from combustible forms of transportation to active forms of transportation, you get reduction of air pollution, right, which has its own health benefits, but you also get in shape, you're healthier, you lose weight, right? So those two things are co-benefits. And that is a very, very important concept because climate change in and of itself leads to a lot of has a lot of health threats with, you know, flooding and heat-related illnesses and wildfires. But also because the sources that lead to greenhouse gas emissions and ocean acidification, for example, are the same sources of environmental pollution. When you get rid of them, then you have these co-benefits. And so, we focus a lot on that. And I would say that while Paris, has this, beautifully written chapter with addressing, people of all walks of life, the most important topic that came up there is, well, what does that mean for when we go back home? What does that mean when we, how do we put this into practice in our own places of where we live and work? And so that's, for us, Philadelphia. How does this get put in place for Philadelphia? And that's why documents like Greenworks and Growing Stronger are really important, because they tackled that very issue. What are the how can we reach this really ambitious aim of global temperature rise of well below 2 degrees, which is what was decided in Paris. How do we achieve that in Philadelphia? And there's a lot of initiatives, for example, the 80 by 50, 80% reduction by 2050. And the question becomes, well, will that get us there? Number one, can we even make 80 by 50? And number two, will 80 by 50 get us to no more than 2 degrees of global temperature rise? And that's where the hard work begins. Because what that means is that we have to address the fact that the infrastructure that we currently have with our dependency on extractive combustible forms of energy sources are no longer compatible with this model, of what I just read to you. And once we face that, then that's when we can really be hopeful about the Paris Agreement. Otherwise, as people say, it's business as usual. And so I'm just going to, wrap it up right now, and I'm sure we'll have more discussions about this, by saying that Paris was, definitely a very an important step, but it's up to us to really make sure that that happens for us on a local level.
Thanks, Bethany, for having me. It's a pleasure to be on this panel. It's rare to join a group with such a diverse interest and background base. Usually it's one-dimensional, everyone kind of speaking the same language. So in a way, I feel like I'm sort of the last mile, if you will, from the work that Brian does to the work that Dave does. Everyone has their role in creating policies that enable clean energy to be actually implemented and put in the ground. And my role for my company, which is called Solar City, is to basically put megawatts of solar on as many rooftops and on many fallow pieces of ground as we can now in the US, but certainly over time internationally. I started in solar about 9 years ago, kind of realizing that that there was an opportunity to kind of almost get into an industry that aligned with my beliefs on where we needed to go economically and with our energy infrastructure generation. Just about the time as kind of the industry started to hit what is our version of Moore's Law, where in the last 7 years alone, solar costs of technology, installation, everything related to putting those megawatts in the ground has dropped by about 70%. So we've seen massive improvements on the cost side of the equation in our industry, which only continues to grow in a virtuous cycle as we put more and more volume in the ground. So very positive about the directions that both solar and wind and other enabling technologies have been able to penetrate on the cost side. The challenge that I didn't realize 9 years ago is that trying to install megawatts of solar on a daily basis is painful. We started as a residential company in 2006. We're founded by two brothers of South African descent who were cousins with Elon Musk, who kind of bankrolled his cousins. Elon is the chairman of Tesla electric car company and SpaceX. And we were able to sort of get out ahead of the competition and really try to disrupt what was then a very high-cost proposition. People just assumed solar was too expensive, higher cost than the kind of incumbent technologies, and the only way to get it was to buy it. And so we had a very small market of typically affluent buyers who had capital and tax capacity and could kind of monetize the benefits of owning solar. In '07, we were able to leverage what's called a power purchase agreement, which enables third-party ownership, typically large tax-paying entities that can benefit from the tax benefits associated with solar, in a somewhat arcane tax structure, which is part of the challenge in the industry and kind of on the policy level. But we were able to provide a very basic proposition to consumers, which was, if you're given the choice, would you buy your energy, if it was cheaper than brown power, would you buy clean energy? So it's kind of a no-brainer, obviously, when you're given the proposition to purchase electricity that is both cheaper and cleaner than the existing technology. It's very hard to say no to that. So great in theory, and it kind of took off quite well. I think we now have 250,000 customers nationally. We then 5 years ago developed a commercial corollary to that business where I come in and sell those power purchase agreements, basically sell solar kilowatt hours to the likes of Philadelphia City or the county of Schenectady, New York, or Walmart. You name a Fortune 500 company or a public sector entity that's trying to focus on sustainability efforts, but also on economics alone and how to save very finite resources that they're trying to use for broad operating budgets. The economics of solar, and obviously wind and other technologies, can really quickly add up and make a huge impact on an entity's approach to energy. Electricity in general is probably one of the more heavily regulated industries in the U.S., and therefore, without a policy, there's no solar market. So inherent in the U.S. is the challenge that we have a very highly dysfunctional federalist system where each state does its own thing. Each state in the U.S. is like a different country when it comes to solar policy. We're active in about 18 states where you're actually allowed to sell kilowatt hours to consumers who want them. The rest of the states, via typically regulated public utility commissions, don't allow third-party sales of electricity. Where they do allow third-party sales of electricity, there might be challenges to other facets of a policy called net metering, where you are allowed to sell electricity, and when you generate more electricity on your rooftop, say during the day when you're not home, that electricity is spinning back to the grid, it's providing benefits to the grid. Do you get compensated for that electricity? If not, it makes the economics of solar much more unfavorable. Therefore, that market is a more challenging market to serve. That's just one example of policies that vary by state. Interconnection is another policy. If you're lucky enough to get all the way down the road to finding customers and finding sites that work for solar, at the end of the day, you need to basically convince the incumbent utility to allow you to interconnect to the grid. And so we have probably as many policy personnel nationally as we do sales personnel as a company. We were in Paris as well. We were very involved in the investment tax credit extension that you might have seen at the end of this last year, which has given the solar industry another 5 years of runway that frankly we need, because we're always catching up to the embedded subsidies that the likes of the natural gas industry enjoys. So I kind of take issue to the fact that natural gas is actually cheaper. It is not cheaper when you kind of incorporate all the embedded subsidies and the externalities, which is but it's those little things that we need to nip in the bud as far as public awareness of on a level playing field. If you were to strip subsidies away from fossil fuels and clean technology, we're winning, and we're already beyond the point of no return. I think it becomes a cultural, contextual issue that Brian mentioned, where it's less about so much green now as it is control. A lot of, I think the younger generation, they're cutting the cord on cable, they're cutting the cord on their phone. They want to cut their cord on the utility as well. Why should they be confined and conscripted to a monopolistic utility when they have the variety of choice, not only cheaper choice, but cleaner choice? So that's the message we're trying to push, and we do that with the help of friends in policy everywhere. At the end of the day, it's sort of it's a capitalist approach, but it's couched in kind of activist policy at the same time. So happy to talk more about that as we get forward.
All right. Thanks again. I'll reiterate the thanks to Bethany for organizing and to you all for sharing your afternoon with us. I'm Sarah Wu. I'm the Deputy Director for Planning in the city's Office of Sustainability. And the Office of Sustainability is charged with implementing Greenworks, which is the city's comprehensive sustainability plan. The author of said plan is sitting in the back of the room there, so I'll watch what I say. It's interesting because Greenworks is called a sustainability plan and is not called a climate action plan, although many of the goals in Greenworks are the same goals that other cities would include in their climate action plan. And so all of the goals in the original Greenworks plan were set for 2015, so they sunset at the end of last year. We have a new mayor now. We're thinking about how do we update Greenworks, and I think an interesting question that we will be discussing with folks in the public in the coming year is, do we want to switch the frame of Greenworks from being a sustainability plan to being a climate action plan? I think we're open to that. It'll be similar work, let's be clear, but I think one of the influences of COP21 on our work is that it might be time to be more explicit about the carbon pollution outcomes of all of the work that we're doing. So let's be clear, I've been working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for the last 6 years of implementing the previous Greenworks plan. But also, let's be clear that we didn't meet our greenhouse gas emissions goals over the last 6 years. So we set a pretty aggressive goal. We were trying to reduce our emissions 30% between 2009 and 2015. And we did see some reductions, but we didn't meet the goal. And sometimes it's good to have aspirational goals, but to Pouné's point, you can set a long-term goal or you can set a short-term goal, and if you're not getting to the goal, it may be an indication to us that we should be changing the way we talk about the goal. So that's, I think, another thing for us to noodle on as we work on this next update of the Greenworks plan. I just wanted to be clear, something that Bethany said in the introduction is that Growing Stronger is not the new Greenworks. There will be another more comprehensive plan. Growing Stronger is just a climate adaptation plan, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. So I think as we move forward and we try to set an aggressive long-term 80% carbon emissions reduction by 2050, we really need to be clear about where our local levers are. We did a report over the course of the last 2 years with some of your colleagues at Drexel, an 80 by 50 report before this new administration decided to commit to an 80 by 50 reduction. We wanted to understand what that would really mean in Philadelphia. And basically we looked at the three big levers we have here. One is the building sector, one is the transportation sector, and the third is our electricity source. In Philadelphia, the biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions is our building stock. So we looked at how can we make that building stock more efficient, make them use less electricity. We looked at transportation. Transportation is also a large user of carbon. How can we get folks out of carbon-burning, combustive transportation resources? But really, I think that the elephant in the room is that we could literally all hop on bikes today and get rid of our cars, and if we didn't decarbonize the electricity grid, we are never going to get to 80 by 50. And I also think we need to have a frank conversation about how that is not a lever that we have a lot of leverage to push on as a city government. So we need to be having this conversation with our PUCs, our state PUCs, the federal government, EPA, Clean Power Plan. while we have some political constipation at our Commonwealth and federal level, people keep looking to cities as where the rubber is meeting the road, and that is true, and that's great, and I'm happy to be working in a place where we can get things done, but I also want to be clear about where our limitations are. We cannot do this alone in cities. Even if all the cities get together and hold hands and sing Kumbaya, if we don't have support from the nested scales of power, we're not going to get to 80 by 50. And again, back to Pouné's point, 80 by 50 may not even be sufficient to get to the reduction in the causes of climate change that we're hoping for. So I guess I became the Debbie Downer of the panel. I'm usually not that. I just want to be clear that that's sort of how COP21 is influencing my thinking on the climate mitigation side of our work. I do think we have really exciting opportunities, both with the Clean Power Plan and to find funding for energy efficiency work on the city scale. I'm hopeful that any real plan for reducing carbon emissions in the United States will consider energy efficiency in buildings as something that will count toward those carbon emissions goals. I will also say that despite all of this lovely work on mitigation of reducing the causes of climate change, as a city, we are also very aware that we need to be preparing for the changes that climate change are already bringing on a local level. We were talking. Full disclosure, 3 of us were on a panel together last night. So last night we were discussing, we've already seen a 0.8 degrees Celsius rise in temperature, and so that is causing real changes on the ground for the city of Philadelphia. We have seen the 2 warmest years on record since 2010, the wettest year on record. We've had a record number of days above 90 in a year. So the weather is already changing in Philadelphia, and that has real consequences for how a city conducts business. And so one of the Growing Stronger report that we've been talking about is our first effort as a city to understand how is the climate already changed, how is it going to change in the near term, in the mid-century, in the long term, and what do we need to do to be prepared to continue to provide the services and maintain the infrastructure that we're responsible to you guys to provide and maintain. And so that's another piece of work that I would say, despite the fact that COP21 was successful, we are obviously not going to discontinue, unfortunately. Even when Greenworks came out in 2009, sort of cities who were committing to climate adaptation were sort of frowned upon. It was like they had given up on mitigation, right? And even in the 3 years between 2009 and 2012, when we were updating the plan in the middle of our implementation course, that had really changed. Sandy had hit. We all sort of realized we've got to do both of these things, throwing your hat in the ring of adaptation doesn't mean that you've given up on your mitigation work, but that you really are responsible for taking on both sides of that climate equation.
Tight fit up here. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm David Masur. I'm the Executive Director for Penn Environment. Penn Environment is a citizen-based environmental advocacy group, and batting cleanup. Hopefully I can try and pull some of this together. I would like to say, Sarah, I do not think you're Debbie Downer. You can embed the word constipation. It's sort of, I can take it anywhere I want now.
I'm glad. I can open that door for you.
Thank you for doing that. Quickly, and then maybe we'll open it up. I think we're at such an important time right now in what has been, for many of us, many years, a decade or longer, fight to first achieve acknowledgement, sadly, and then action on the issue of climate change. And to me, COP21 is one of the just essentially critical measures of the important moment in time we're achieving right now. And I think all of the speakers today hit on a couple of main points that I hope you'll take away from this confluence, this historic time we're all in together. As you heard, obviously there are incredible challenges that have made it really hard to even get where we are today. Our fight to tackle climate change, promote clean energy, has been riddled with the reality that we have to take on deep pockets, spending often hundreds of millions, billions of dollars through our political process, through the media, to keep a status quo that is not in the public's interest. At the same time, we're trying to tackle an issue when you really get deep in the weeds of the substance. It can be very depressing. As Bethany noted, for many people, it's probably easier to think about opting off, getting off the grid in a different way than John referenced, because it is a very profound problem we face if we don't tackle climate change. And the dire effects really make it a hard issue, I think, for the public to want to face head-on and tackle. So I think the first thing I hope people recognize, we should reiterate this regularly, is this is a huge challenge, taking on a profound problem, the likes of which have substantive challenges in climate change and real political problems in our democratic process to tackle climate change. That being said, I think we're also in an incredible moment of time of making headway in a way we have never seen before in this issue, and I think you heard a lot of that today as well from our speakers. Public support is higher than it's ever been for tackling climate change. Bethany made some jokes about some of the folks running for president of the United States. The fact that, people who don't believe in climate change are a punchline to a joke, that is a fringe concept, has shown how quickly we have moved in a relatively short period of time against the odds we face on this particular issue. I think it's incredible given that often public opinion and politics can be quite glacial. So I think, number one, we've seen public support the likes of which we've never seen it before. If it's from the public, if it's from business leaders, sometimes it seems like we're losing traction in the polarized political world we live in. But even on both sides of the aisle, we see more and more of the public acknowledge and resign to the fact that climate change is happening, and all of the money spent to tell us otherwise or misinform us will not keep us from the truth. So that's number one. Number two, as noted, COP21, I believe, is one of a whole set of historic policies we're seeing taking place, not only globally, but here in the United States. For folks who are following action in Washington, D.C., which is often seen as intractably constipated, some may say.
Hypothetically.
Yes. The reality is, I believe that our current president is trying hard to make climate change his environmental legacy. It seems like nearly every week the White House will come out with another announcement to address climate change. And as Peter mentioned, the Clean Power Plan is undoubtedly the single largest step we have taken as a nation to tackle global warming pollution from the single largest source, which is our power sector. You have COP21, you have conversations with China, you have conversations with India, the biggest polluters trying to come to the table. You have cities like Philadelphia, San Francisco, New York, all vying to be the leader in tackling climate change. That is a political paradigm shift that we did not have even 5 years ago, obviously. So a huge historic policy change, which I think also is showing the headway. As John noted, the economic forces today are so different when it comes to promoting the solution. People are seeing the clean jobs opportunity, realizing that the boom-bust economy we have relied on for fossil fuels does not work. It leaves people with jobs one day and without jobs the next, and just the amount of job creation in the clean energy sector it's really incredible to see. So I think that's the third point, is we have economic forces that have made it affordable. We have people who truly recognize and believe the clean energy economy is the way forward, and so many workers, businesses showing that this is true and good for consumers as well. And tied to that, of course, is just technology. Every day it feels like it's taking such big steps to tackle this problem. To me, this is a huge, for me, it gives me hope, the fact that we are a nation built on taking problems before us, using our elbow grease, our technological know-how, and our smarts to tackle those problems. I believe on climate change very strongly. We put a man on the moon decades ago. This is a problem. If we put our mind to it, we can tackle it. It's not about lack of desire or smarts. It's a question of our political will to do this. So, for all those reasons, I'm somewhat hopeful, as you can tell, that we can solve this very profound problem, and COP21 is just one piece in the puzzle to do that. Now, of course, maybe I'll wrap up by saying this is the beginning, not the end, in how we change some of the constructs by which we have lived for so long. I think this breaks the logjam on policy and economics that have really held us back. And maybe I'll wrap up by saying, I couldn't agree more with Pouné, who said, doesn't it make you feel like it's going to be a beautiful world, that there is a chance to do this? So COP21 is a great part of this, just a historic moment in time to tackle such a huge problem.
Thanks to our presenters. We're going to give them 10 minutes or so to talk with each other, and then we'll open up the floor to you. One of the great things about being an organizer is that you often get to ask the first question, which I'm going to do right now. And it's specifically, I just wanted to invite all of the panelists, but particularly maybe Sarah and David, to talk a little bit about your expectations for the new mayoral administration and Jim Kenney's plans. As I mentioned in my introduction, David did chair that transition team for Mayor Kenney, and so we have some good knowledge to talk about that.
You want to rock, paper, scissors? Or?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yes. So what is the city doing? And I should note a few things. Number one, my friend Pouné here was part of the transition team. It was really an honor to both try and help the new mayor tackle some of these pressing issues and to serve all of you in the city to really try and leverage the transition team to push for the most far-reaching policies possible, both to make Philadelphia a leader and tackle some of these issues. To Mayor Kenney's credit, when I was asked to do this, he said, you pull together the team of people, figure out who's going to do it, and come up with the policies that you think we should implement. And I thought that was one of many signs that this is a mayor who cares deeply about the environment, sustainability, promoting clean energy, tackling issues like climate change. We have submitted our plan to the mayor. Always a caveat is, we do our homework, and it's up to the elected officials to decide what they'll take and not take. But I think we pulled together a number of policies that are doable, but that would make Philadelphia really a leader in tackling climate change and promoting the clean energy alternatives that are going to put us on the path to doing that. I don't want to get too far ahead about our mayor, but I do think in the upcoming weeks, the mayor and his staff will make a bunch of, come on, okay. What he's going to do is, we'll make a number of announcements showing his commitment to clean energy and the environment. I should also add that I'm very optimistic because I think the mayor has surrounded himself with great, talented people. Obviously, Sarah brings a ton of expertise and experience. Christine Knapp, Mike DeBerdinis. There's a whole list of folks who have really cut their teeth on these issues, and I think having them in Mayor Kenney's inner circle are both a sign of his commitment, and they're the people who will lead the charge. So I'm hopeful that we'll see great things come out in the next 4 years.
Sure. I'll just add to say, we certainly are going to update Greenworks, and I think I'm excited about the opportunity to set new goals. I'm excited about the opportunity to have a conversation with folks about what those goals should be. But I also think we took care of a lot of the low-hanging fruit in the first 6 years of Greenworks, and so it's going to be interesting to see. I think this is an opportunity for us to step up and set some transformational goals. And I also think that it's an opportunity to focus on the people side of things. So I think that climate is a really interesting frame to get to both of those issues. You need to set goals about deep systems change on the mitigation side, and on the adaptation side, you need to say this is already having real effects on the ground in people's everyday lives. And so I'm excited about getting into some of those thornier issues of systems that are beyond our control, but that we can push for, and using this as a frame to address some of the real inequity that exists in the city of Philadelphia.
I just wanted to add that I definitely agree with David and Sarah, but I will also say that there are parts of the city that, in my opinion, are what I would consider would be like ground zero of how this is going to play out. Southport is one of them, and as some of you may or may not know, there are competing plans for what can Southport be. One of them is what has been happening all along, where Southport becomes part of this the fossil fuel infrastructure for liquefied natural gas and the refinery that's in South Philadelphia. The alternative plan is a vision for, like, let's say, offshore wind. And so I'm curious, I'm very interested to know, how will this administration play out, these areas where you can go down, any side of this fork in the road.
I think that the economic development paradigms that David mentioned are changing. And I used to work with the city of Philadelphia myself about 10 years ago, where the metric is permanent job creation. It's how do we're going to invest our dollars, we're going to choose the project based on jobs, which makes a lot of sense. The problem with renewable energy is that most of those jobs are construction jobs. Because the virtue of renewable energy is you build a wind farm or a solar farm and it sits there and produces energy. It doesn't need much in the way of maintenance. So how do you transpose the paradigm of economic development, job creation onto a different metric? And that metric obviously is going to include impact on climate. And that's no easy task for you guys to handle, obviously. But with the data and the analytics that are increasingly out there, I think we're starting to come to a realization that those metrics need to change. And some of the cities that Bethany mentioned are, I think, slightly ahead of us as far as thinking about
Economic development through the kind of green infrastructure lens. I'm also struck by the challenges that you mentioned. You're sort of captive to the state, much like the analogy, gun control. You're captive to the state as a city, and there's not much you can do without the enabling policy, enabling legislation that in many states is owned by the public utility commissions. Still heavily politicized and appointed. We're in a major battle in Nevada, for example, right now, which is kind of a shot across the bow for the solar industry, and we're seeing more and more of those fights play out now that solar and wind are threatening the incumbents. It's a very interesting time to be engaged on the political level. So I'm going to come back to Brian as far as I'm curious what you think about the history of particularly public utility commissions. We saw Obama just come forth the other day with a new $10 fee on a barrel of oil, trying to tag that into the PURPA legislation. So are you seeing anything happening in terms of trends at public utility commissions that might help us feel better about what we're doing?
Well, and I'm afraid, hopeful, yeah, I think it is working, yeah. That's the kind of infrastructure that I think makes us all very cynical. We heard a few suggestions, but when you go back as far as, the Texas sort of utility commission that has set our prices on oil for decades, these are the kind of behind the scenes, almost X-Files-like power structures that make you doubt that such infrastructural change can ever take place. I would trust your judgment more on what's going on right now. I think this, looking in the larger scheme, though, what I see is the kind of consumer pressure building that we've never seen before. And so, one of the questions I'd turn it around right back at you or anyone else who wanted to address it is what kind of impact does the consumer pressurizing this kind of a paradigm have? Because one of the hypotheses that I'm working with is that culturally speaking, we're living in a moment unlike any before, and we don't know how it'll end. And I personally think it's the most hopeful on this regard that we've seen in a long time. But this is the kind of infrastructural limiter that behind the scenes, outside of the consumers, can really make it a challenge. But so, what do you see can consumers against that kind of a pressure, if we're going to say those utility commissions are not going to change business as usual for as long as they can hold out, what kind of an impact can consumption and consumer choice have?
Yeah, I think it's huge. I'll defer, but quickly. I mean, I was in a meeting the other day with a large Northwestern utility who basically said they need to get involved and build more solar, or they're going to lose their biggest customers, the likes of Nike, Amazon. All, the buying power of the consumer is telling their retail purveyors that they care about where their energy comes from. So most of our customers, Walmart, Amazon, Best Buy, they're all feeling that pressure. They're also seeing the economic benefits absent any consumer pressure. They realize they can actually save a ton of money by doing this, and by the way, it helps their brand. But the utility was interesting. They said, we think there's going to be two kinds of utilities in the next 10 years. Those like us who figure out how to get on this wagon, and those that die. So, I mean, it's definitely come to the point where, and I think through that lens, the consumer is pressuring up to the ultimate buyers of electric load, then pressuring utilities. That's got to come back to the political economy of the PUCs. So definitely, great point.
Can I add one thing? Folks aren't paying attention to this fight that's taking place as clean energy has become a threat to the status quo. It's happening in states and at the federal level every day. So it's the Nevada fight. We had a pretty close vote in California now 2 weeks ago where the solar industry, I think, eked out.
Last week,
Breathing a sigh of relief. I think a one vote margin, basically, that would have made it harder for residents to take advantage of solar. We've seen, even here in Pennsylvania, net metering problems. And, these are companies that obviously they don't wear that on their sleeve. That's not the, commercial you'll see on TV is, hey, we're the big dirty polluter, and we're making sure we stomp on the back of solar companies. Hey, right? That's not, but we have it here. I mean, folks may know that one of the biggest opponents to the tax credits that John was touting was Eco and Exelon. I mean, they were saying you can't give these clean energy companies this break. At the same time, they were part of the American Wind Energy Association. They got kicked out because they were. We just said, wait, you can't be part of our group and oppose policies that are good for us. And I think the public doesn't know that political fight, in the underbelly of D.C. and state capitals is happening every day. But people should be very cognizant this is coming down the pike because the status quo is getting more and more threatened by the change in our sector. So those of us in politics see it every day, but I think that's a great point to make, John.
I just wanted to actually interject two things. One on this thread right now, and then go back a little bit to something that was mentioned earlier. How many people remember CDs? Remember that fight with the recording industry on MP3s and transitioning from CDs to MP3s and suing college students and basically making themselves look really foolish before they just adopted MP3s? Energy companies have a lot more money. They have a lot more money and a lot more drive to keep the status quo. So it's going to be a hard fight. And it's like that times a Googleplex. I don't know. I mean, it's going to be hard to get a transition to a clean energy economy. But use that as kind of a frame of reference for what the fight is about with much bigger stakes. And I wanted to ask people on the sustainability city team, just going back to an earlier thing, kind of the elephant in the room that was mentioned is the refinery. How is that accounted for in an 80 by 20 plan? 80 by 50, I'm sorry. That'd be awesome, 80 by 20. That's actually the trajectory we need in many ways because CO2 lasts for 100 years in the atmosphere. So if we finally drop to whatever we are and what we need to be in 2050, there's still embodied emissions from now until that time that we have to deal with. But the refinery from a climate, I mean, we're selling CO2 in the form of gasoline to other places that are then burning it. Is that accounted for in the Philadelphia sustainability, or are we just kind of hoping that we don't think about that too much?
So the way greenhouse gas emission accounting works, the emissions from the processing here count for our inventory, but it's where the gasoline is burned. Well, I mean, it's a little more complicated than that, but we're not, you know, all of the gas that's produced here the burning of that doesn't go on our inventory. So, and it's like we're a drug dealer, yeah. That said, the refinery is a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions, and so, you know, I think any 80 by 50 plan would have to, you know, you could look at it with the refinery in there, or you could look at it without, and you'll see how the numbers fall with it and without it. You know, I think that's the beauty of having a goal and being very explicit about the possible pathways of getting there, is that you got to go there. You got to say, this is one of the sources, and here's what our future looks like with it in the inventory, and here's what our future looks like it without it in the inventory.
One of the issues that did come up regarding the refinery and that whole area is the labor force that's, you know, employed in the industry, and being very cognizant of what happens to these workers and their jobs. And so one of the concepts that I personally, you know, co-wrote a piece about was the concept of what's called a just transition, which is, or a just transition fund, which is a fund where workers who are currently employed in the fossil fuel industry are given job training to be able to enter the renewable, clean, you know, non-combustible energy sector. And that fund would also support, for example, medical benefits, you know, and unemployment while that transition happens. And in that way, we, you know, really take care of this, you know, sector of our, you know, Philadelphia society that currently really relies on the refinery as our job, and so you know, we have to think of it in kind of the strategy would consider that, you know, as part of the, you know, the transition.
I have so many questions. I just don't know where to begin. First of all, I'm from Delaware County, and part of the problem, I think, too, throughout Pennsylvania, is a lack of cooperation. We know how bad the emissions are in this area along the 95 corridor, and that includes Delaware County and Bucks County, in addition to Philadelphia. I just recently went to a DEP public comment session in Marcus Hook, and I can tell you, I don't even know how you can get any cooperation from Delaware County, but especially with, you know, concerning Marcellus Shale. But for one question I have, first of all, if I can break down a couple questions.
Actually, just one question, please.
Okay, knowing that, I just want to know, in general, where is the tipping point when it comes to climate change? It's my understanding that when the glaciers melt and we have that cold water going into the oceans, and it affects things like the Gulf Stream, and we may end up going into a cold period, possibly ice age. So where exactly is that?
Scientist, yeah.
That's a good question, and I think the answer is we don't know, which isn't the greatest answer. The climate is a very complex system. There's a lot of relationships between different systems. As you mentioned, the cryosphere or the ice sheets are really important, and melting of those can slow down the Gulf Stream current, which is what brings heat to the northern latitudes. If that shuts off, we get less heat to northern Europe, and you can have a potential ice age. That's one of the predicted outcomes of a shutdown of the Gulf Stream. When that happens, how that happens is very, very difficult to predict.
So so another way of looking at that is globally, what is the global temperature rise that the Earth can tolerate, right, before which it's a point of no return, right? That's really kind of, I think, what you're asking. And so the the language says it should be well below 2 degrees Celsius. However, when this maximum global temperature rise was brought up, the small island nations came in and said, absolutely no way. Already we're dying, we're going underwater, and that we will not settle for anything above 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so then the compromise was to say well below 2 degrees Celsius. That's what the compromise of the language of the agreement says. And then with the caveat that if it's 1.5 degrees for the small island nations, we're already halfway there. We're already at 0.8 degrees Celsius to that limit. So, and that if we currently aggregate the plans for all the countries that signed on to Paris in terms of what they want to do for greenhouse gas emissions, it's only going to take us to 3.7 degrees Celsius. So not 2, not 1.5, and we're already 0.8 of it there. So I don't know if that helps you in terms of your question of where is the point of no return. You could say, let's say it's at 1.5 degrees Celsius, considering that the small island nations matter a lot, and that we're halfway there.
Okay, I really appreciate the local focus of all of your work and your words now. You've mentioned a number of areas where there are plans in place or plans are being developed that involve transportation, reduction of greenhouse gases, efficiency, and so on. What health is obviously really important. What I didn't hear and what I would like to hear something about is agriculture, food production, diet, and so on, because I believe that that's also a really important factor also in relation to the production of greenhouse gases.
Yeah. So yes, absolutely. The forests actually were the big winners in Paris. The only reason I don't talk about it is because it's not my area of expertise, so I don't want to say it without really kind of like a full understanding and knowledge of it. Yes, so yes, forests came out as big winners, and as I'm sure everybody knows, forests and oceans are going to be our saviors. If anything's going to save us, it's going to be the forests and the oceans, and that there was an incredible amount of turnout from the farming communities in Paris. Many of the agricultural, communities around the world, as well as like organic farming communities, are organizations from the United States and and the developed nations. They showed up in large numbers, and there was, a big showing of that there. We can, and yes, that in and of itself, I think, would be like a whole nother session and a discussion, but supremely important. I definitely agree with that.
Just to throw in two things, I think you mentioned agriculture as a source of emissions, but I think it's also important to think about agriculture in the context of climate change. And plants have an optimal growing temperature, and as we increase temperature, growing areas are going to move northward. Places where we traditionally grow things are not going to have the same growing seasons that they did. Plants are going to be outside of that optimal range. Depending on how precipitation is affected in these places, you either have more intense rains or maybe you have less rain. That can also impact. And the prediction is that yields will likely decrease unless we genetically engineer better crops that are more drought resistant and can deal with the higher temperatures. And so there's two things. Yes, animal husbandry, raising animals, is a methane generation, and methane's a greenhouse gas, and so the more corn-fed beef we eat, the more methane will be released, but also the impact on plants and how much we can grow and what the yields of plants will be per acre, and if populations increase, how do we feed the world, basically. So there's lots of things to consider in the agricultural sector, and not all good in that context.
Hi. My question is about the electricity sector. We hear from the panel, what are the options? Because we just heard that, producing electricity by gas is not optimal or is not desirable. And also from, if we see the combined electricity production from coal and gas in Pennsylvania, which represent like 50% of the total production, how are we going to replace these technologies? How is the solar industry could be at the scale to replace all this required capacity? Because the problem is the pace. Like, could that be made on, I mean, we obviously have these targets, but the amount of electricity produced by coal and gas is very, very high. And so is the solar sector, I mean, ready to do it? And also, we heard this week here at Wharton that the nuclear industry, adding additional capacity from the nuclear industry is very difficult and almost impossible from all the regulatory burden. So what are the options?
Great question. I think PJM's total generating capacity is around 150 gigawatts, right? So more or less. In the US alone last year, there were 10 gigawatts of solar built, and there's now a cumulative amount of about 55 gigawatts of solar in the US. So 20% of all US solar was built in the last year, which reflects the hyper growth that we're seeing right now. And I don't think it's appropriate to say we can replace the entire coal and natural gas infrastructure anytime soon. But we can certainly build a gigawatt of solar faster than you could site, permit, and build a gigawatt of fossil fuel production, whether that's natural gas. Obviously, no one's building coal plants anymore. The technology's there, and it's all about now deployment. It was interesting, there's a debate, I think Bill Gates came out with a big pile of money for R&D funding a few months ago that sort of created a debate that got a bit heated between those who think we don't need any more R&D money, we need to deploy what's in front of us. We can put all this technology to work today and get there in 5-10 years. The other side of the camp thinks that we need to focus more on R&D and develop the next generation futuristic, I'm going to just beam a photon onto your roof and you'll have all your power that you need. I think there's a happy medium there. My company does a lot of work in storage, which is kind of the next generation of, and once you can build solar and combine it with storage, wind and storage to get over the intermittent resource issues that you have with renewable technology. The wind's not always blowing, the sun's not always shining, so it's not a base load that you get from a coal or natural gas plant. I think that nuclear, I mean, there's been, and you cited it, I think nuclear is challenged by the inherent costs, heavily subsidized. If it's ever going to work, it just takes a massive amount of taxpayer subsidy to guarantee those projects that take 10 years to build. So if you look at a nuclear plant of 2 gigawatt kind of standard size, you could build 20 times the amount of solar in 10 years as you could build a nuke plant. And I think Duke Fuqua had a nice study on that. There's been research to support that. But I think one plug for a writer named David Roberts, if people want to kind of read a current analysis of everything renewable. You might know him, David. Vox.com is the site, but he's, I think, one of the more, the brighter minds that's able to kind of distill a lot of these elements into reality, because I think in reality we have the technology to get that done, and it's really about enabling policy and legislation. It's got to happen at the political level.
Yeah, maybe I'll add two quick things to John's point. Number one, we're all going to have to go in it together. There are places that are better and worse for how we produce this energy and can give the nation, the planet, more or less. And you see it in wind production in the plain states where there's not a lot of people but a lot of land and they're producing a lot of wind. We're finally breaking down on offshore wind, particularly on the East Coast, in the shallower Atlantic and the Great Lakes. There's obviously optimal sun in the Southwest and more space again to try and really have a breakthrough. So, it may not be in the most dense places like Philadelphia, even though we'll have to do our part as well. So I think you have to look at the whole picture, and there's, I think, more and more great science coming out about a blueprint for how we have the ability today for this country to be 100% renewable if we chose to flex our muscle and do that. That's number one. Number two, there are two sides of this coin. One is how we produce our energy, and one is what we do with it once we produced it. And I think the harsh reality is our electricity system is highly wasteful, and we could make huge cuts in our consumption on the grid, in our buildings, our electricity use. As the saying goes, the cheapest, cleanest electricity is the megawatt you never have to produce in the first place. And so we have to just be much more cognizant as a country on how we promote energy efficiency and conservation. If we make big cuts there, we can make up the difference on the clean side.
Oh, hi, thank you again for coming to the panel. I'm a student in Wharton and engineering school. So I guess my question relates to, on the one hand, today's discussion has a theme about energy transitions, historically looking at what that is and what the future of that transition would look like. And on the second hand, there was a phrase, I think, about deep pockets and entrenched economic interests. So in that context, either here at Penn or, in pension funds in, different levels of government, what are your thoughts about, for institutional investors like Penn's endowment, which has very deep pockets, how should it move forward to a collective future where we do have that energy transition?
Invest all your money in solar cities. Best kept secret in the
cut
market.
the tape.
Thank you, good night.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, from our perspective, there's Solar City's original investors, this group DBL, this woman Nancy Fund, started, it is a huge luminary among impact investors. And her returns for investing in Tesla, investing in Solar City, investing in 5 or 6 other kind of disruptive technologies, they crush any other investment returns among pension funds, endowments, et cetera. So you're starting to see that not only are the returns there, which interests, I think, the retail investor, but the likes of Bill McKibben, who spends his life on carbon, divesting endowments. You see him every year. I'm sure he's been to Penn and Wharton. Like, what are you doing with your endowment? How do you understand where you're invested and how can you pull out? That's a great point that I think is slowly going to dilute the deep pockets that David mentioned.
There is the fossil fuel-free Penn, which, if I see people nodding in the audience, so fossil fuel-free represent. And I know that there was a letter where Penn faculty were asked to sign, and it was presented to the board of directors, and now there's an ad hoc committee that's going to, right, am I saying this right? Okay. That's going to look at Penn divesting from fossil fuels. So I think that that's definitely the right direction to go, and highly urge and encourage the board of directors to seriously consider that.
And again, just to amplify, I really was going to say it right then too, a point that we made earlier. I mean, that's also part of this consumer paradigm shift, because that's a demand being put on these entities, if they're institutional or if they're corporations, similar to what we were hearing about before. So, it's about empowered grassroots movements as well.
Hi. I was really interested in the panel today, in part because you made infrastructure, what Susan Neistar once called a very boring thing, very interesting, right? And it seems clear that it's a site for much action and activity as we imagine post-carbon futures. And I was struck, I think, both in John and Sarah's points about how the public utility and the politics that surrounds it is a really important site for political action, right? So I was wondering, in part because it works at a scale that both escapes our global interests and attentions and our very local ones, right? It's somewhere in the middle over there. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how and why public utilities have been so invisible in environmental discourses until now, and what might change that? What might make them a site of political action, make them more interesting to both urban politics but also global politics?
I'd love to say a few words to that. I think it's a few reasons. At Penn Environment, we're a citizen-based group. Some of the real challenges around the PUC are, number one, you're asking the public to hold an entity accountable they've mostly never heard of. They don't know what it does, and they don't know the people on it. That's not a very compelling story in democracy. They don't elect the PUC in most states. I think there's some exceptions, maybe the Cub in Oregon or some other states, but they're not accountable to us in the democratic process. They're appointed. And so I think for a lot of the organizations that Penn Environment works with, then the strategy for dealing with the PUC is, number one, you can litigate against them. This is America. We love to sue the pants off people, so we'll just sue the PUC too. And then secondly, because they're often appointed, the reality in Pennsylvania is probably we will see a very different PUC in about 8 weeks when one of the Governor Corbett holdovers term finishes and Governor Wolf puts a new member onto the PUC. I think that will change, a whole set of things for John and other industries because you'll have a much more supportive PUC to push through stronger net metering, regulations around solar, wind, buildings efficiency. But it's hard because, it's not your mayor, it's not your governor. It's mostly people no one have heard about and they sure don't elect them.
If you're thinking about appointed people who we should care about in this discussion, we should also discuss the folks at the Commonwealth level who are appointed to set state standards for the building code. And that's another place where we will hopefully see some turnover within the next 6 months, but we are in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania working on a very outdated building code, and as we've established multiple times in this panel, buildings are one of the biggest emitters of carbon pollution in the state, and so if we're building new buildings to an old code, that is not good for all of the goals that we've enumerated up here.
I just wanted to jump in just for a second to alert you that there is, as part of this curriculum for the new normal, there's a symposium coming up on infrastructure. So I would really encourage you to mark your calendars. I'm going to get the dates wrong if I don't actually look.
And I would just add that there are some progressive PUCs out there or corollaries to them. New York, for example, is going through what they're calling reimagining the electric vision, the REV process, which is basically trying to completely upend the way utilities interact with the grid. As you might know right now, utilities are basically guaranteed a rate of return for investing dollars and creating new transmission and distribution. So they're economically incented to just build more stuff. This is trying to change that model so that we can get back to a distributed generation model, generate electricity closer to where it's used, you lose less of the line loss, utilities become more of a grid maintenance and grid stability service and get paid for that, because we don't want grid defection, and I don't think anyone wants that. You lose the nodal network benefits of the grid that can be quite important, but we do need to change the model that utilities are the basic fundamental model of how they survive and get revenue.
Okay, we have time for one final question. Go ahead.
Yes, I had a question for John about solar and jobs, and my question was, with talks of this energy hub, it seems that proponents have been more short-sighted and saying that it's good because we'll create jobs, people will work at the refineries, but at the same time, the people against Energy Hub have claimed that, we need to go towards renewable resources like solar. And I was just wondering, how do the number of jobs created between solar and refineries compare in the short term and the long term?
Yeah, great question, and hugely important, as mentioned, as far as we're seeing it right now play out in coal. I mean, the people in West Virginia coal country are totally impoverished right now because their industry is dying. And so I think from a policy level, you need to figure out how to make investments in all pockets that can provide equitable growth in the industry. solar jobs are really about, installation jobs and manufacturing jobs. So we're building a manufacturing plant now in Buffalo. It's the largest kind of fab in the Western Hemisphere. Thousands of jobs in Buffalo. Those are actually real jobs that are going to stimulate the economy. There's 250,000 jobs in the solar industry now, which is more than coal, more than nat gas. I think you're starting to see the shift of the permanence. We've already kind of passed the point, the tipping point, where the kind of new job development, new job growth is definitely in clean energy infrastructure development. And it's all about, as mentioned, I think, how to deal with that transition in a most equitable way. So I totally understand the debate there and how you can carve out, you've got to carve out a way to train a workforce. Just like the Navy Yard in Philadelphia, like when we needed to commercialize that shipyard, there were 40,000 people down there at one point working on building Navy ships. How do you keep those 40,000 jobs in the city while you try to transform to a new economy? And I think that's a model that can be replicated down there in some fashion.
Okay, we're going to squeeze in one quick final question.
Thanks, Bethany. My name is Matt Walker. I'm with Clean Air Council and also with a new coalition called Green Justice Philly, which is pushing for a just and sustainable future for Philadelphia, as well as opposing any proposals for dirty energy infrastructure. And my question is, if we know we need to cut greenhouse gases 80% by 2050, or as several panelists have suggested, that probably isn't enough, then what does it mean for several energy companies and powers that be suggesting what's been dubbed the energy hub for Philadelphia, but a bunch of proposals for or future yet to be proposed pipe dreams for the city that would be based on getting natural gas into the city, refining it, transporting it, and that type of thing. What does that mean for our greenhouse gas goals, for our public health and air quality goals, and what do we do to address it?
That feels like a loaded question coming. Anyone who knows Matt Walker from the Clean Air Council, that's loaded. Well, I think as was stated earlier, and at Penn Environment, we think that's not a sustainable path if it comes to climate change or the cradle-to-grave problems that come from fracking and fossil fuels. So, one thing we know is when you build it, there will be an argument made in the economic sector that then you have to use it until it's done or until you pay to upgrade it, and on and on and on. And I think, this red herring of, natural gas as the transition fuel is politically naive, to say the least. I mean, I don't know if anyone can come up with an example in our free market economy and politics that when an entity becomes the 800-pound gorilla in their economic sector, they just sort of move out of the way and let somebody else have a chance. That's not exactly how our free market works. So that is, I mean, I'm not a historian, so maybe I'll be correct. But so I do think the other piece of that is, there's a debate that, well, it is cleaner at point of combustion, so we can use this as sort of a gateway. And, I think for both those reasons, it's a red herring, and we've got to get off fossil fuels. It's outdated and bad from beginning to end, so.
Nobody wants to be outdated, but unfortunately we are out of time. It's been a really great discussion. Thank you all for coming. Thank you especially to our panelists.